I'm Susan Dudley. I'm the founder of the GWU Regulatory Studies Center and a professor in the Trachtenberg School, so professor of public policy and former administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. And I'm joined today by Michael Mandel, who's the vice president and chief economist at the Progressive Policy Institute, and prolific writer and commentator on things at the intersection of policy, technology, and innovation. Is that a fair statement, Michael?
It's a fair statement.
And also Reeve, who raised here from Richmond, where he is director of the Office of Regulatory Management for the Commonwealth of Virginia. And they just had a big announcement today that maybe you'll talk to us a little bit about. So I'm sure he did not break any Virginia speed limit rules on his way up 95 to get here. Reeve served for more than a decade at the Administrative Conference of the United States, including as its research director. And he's also widely published in the regulatory area. So we're going to run this as I'll ask them some questions, and we will try to save time for audience questions. So please use the Slido, and I'll pull up my iPad, and I probably won't be able to ask all the questions that you present, but hope we can do some. So Michael, I'm going to start with you. So I think I first learned about you when you wrote a paper proposing a regulatory improvement commission. So could you tell us a little, and this is a while ago, tell us a little about that, what you saw as the need and your proposal.
Sure. Thank you very much, Susan, for inviting me here today. Really, the big subtitle of my remarks will be Congress in the Loop, which is not quite the same thing as human in the loop, but has some similarities. I also want to just say a couple of words about PPI. We're a think tank, which we've been around since the 1980s, and we believe in growth and innovation. We also believe in the importance of regulation. So that puts us kind of in the middle ground on a lot of these issues. And we're very concerned with making sure that we have processes that sort of work for everybody. So the Regulatory Improvement Commission idea came into being about 10 years or so ago, when we were thinking about retrospective regulatory review. And we wanted to improve it in a way that included Congress as well. So we developed what we called it the RIC, the Regulatory Improvement Commission, which was basically built on the old base closing commission process. It's an organized process for sort of dealing with tough decisions. So the idea was that Congress would, appoint a bipartisan commission to look through regulations, looking for regulations that were redundant or too complicated or could be improved, put together a package of these changes, which would go through Congress for an up or down vote. Now, this idea was codified into the Regulatory Improvement Act of 2015, which had bipartisan support. It came around several different times. The last version that I saw was the Regulatory Improvement Act of 2019, once again with bipartisan support. And this is something that gave Congress two bites of the regulatory apple. One is just sort of when they set up the commission, and the other is when they voted the package of changes up or down. And the idea is that the original laws were passed by Congress, and that you couldn't make changes without Congress's active approval. And there was a deeper motivation too, which was to sort of build up the capability of Congress to sort of deal with regulatory issues and to sort of have Congress take more of the responsibility for outcomes of the laws that they pass.
Why don't you bring it to the present day and tell us how can AI contribute, enhance it, the idea?
Well, even though this was designed in the pre-AI era, it fits in very nicely because originally the idea was that we would have staff that was seconded from agencies to help develop which regulations or rules needed to be changed or improved. But it makes more sense to sort of have AI sort of produce the potential sets of not just rules, but sort of which packages of rules might be able to get support. Now you can see that from a point of view of governance, okay, we're using AI in the support role at this point, not as sort of making the decisions itself. Now, a little bit later in this panel, I'll point out there's other ways that you could sort of do this, and that it's very important sort of not just having Congress in the loop, but that Congress is in the loop fundamentally, because this kind of goes along with what Carrie talked about in terms of the value production technology. We're interested in political policymakers making decisions, whether we like it or not. That's kind of where the legitimacy comes from. And we designed a process that sort of could both effectively deal with the question of sort of reviewing the regulatory structure while also sort of keeping Congress in the place where it deserves to be.
Building bridges, humans in the loop, humans out of the loop, or humans a little more involved than just in the loop. You'd like Congress a little more, not just in the loop, but in making that final decision.
That's right. I think in terms of the points that were sort of made earlier about what's the appropriate role of the human element. Okay, we're going to sort of use AI to sort of collect as much information as possible to give Congress the capability to make the decisions, but not allow to have Congress fundamentally in the loop.
That makes sense. And I see Bridget looking pensively, and I think she approves. So Reeve, tell us, well, first maybe just tell us a little bit more. So the Office of Regulatory Management is relatively new. Governor Youngkin set it up, and you're only its second director. So tell us a little more about what its mission.
Absolutely. I would be happy to. The Office of Regulatory Management is an office Governor Youngkin created via Executive Order, Executive Order 19 back in 2022. And you could basically think of this as being like a state-level OIRA. And what I find fascinating is that, and I don't know this for absolutely sure, but from what I've seen, I don't think there's really any equivalent to that in any other state. There are states that have budget and planning offices, but in terms of having an entity within the governor's office that is sort of the go-to entity for regulatory issues, I want to say we're pretty much the only game in town. So it's been really fun and interesting, to be part of standing this office up and sort of, learning from our federal counterparts at OIRA and looking at how we can sort of apply those same principles of centralized review of regulation at the state level. Just to highlight a few things that we do. So we actually work with each of the 66 agencies in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and we do cost-benefit analysis actually on all regulations and guidance documents, 100% of regulations and guidance documents, which is also a big difference compared to the federal level, where it's a smaller economically significant regulations under 12866 that undergo a full CBA. And I'm happy to elaborate on the discussion at sort of how we do that and what our model is. We review all of the regulations and guidance documents that are issued by the agencies. So we see each of them as along with the cost-benefit analysis and decide, working with the governor, whether to allow them to move forward or to send them back for additional work. We also are responsible for leading a 25% reduction in regulatory requirements and in the length of guidance documents at the statewide level. Finally, we work on licensing and permitting. We've actually created, and I think this is the first of its kind as well, a dashboard where you can actually go and see every single permit application in the state, or at least those that have multiple steps, and track it like you would a FedEx package. You can actually log on and see where your permit is, and that's been a game changer in terms of really speeding things up. And then we lead the governor's AI efforts, which I'll speak on in a minute. Just briefly, so Susan mentioned I just actually raced up here from Richmond. So today we actually had an event where we have officially hit our 25% target. We've actually reduced or streamlined 26.8% of the requirements in the Commonwealth of Virginia. We've actually blown through the target with respect to guidance documents. We're at a 47.8% reduction in the length of those documents. That's about 11.5 million words, or 19 times the length of Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace, for reference. And we tabulate, based on our cost-benefit analysis, that the changes that we've made are saving Commonwealth citizens about $1.2 billion per year. So major savings as a result of our work.
That's fascinating. And now one of the ways, just quickly, you define reducing regulatory requirements. Tell us how you define a requirement.
Certainly. So basically, we went in and this actually goes back to 2018. This is actually a little bit before our time, but there was a bill passed by the General Assembly that tasked every single agency in Virginia in going in and tabulating the number of requirements that they have. So it's not just regulations or chapters. They literally went through word by word. And any time it said you shall do something, you must do something, or you may not do something, that counted as a requirement. Overall, there are about 330 some odd thousand requirements in the Commonwealth of Virginia, which from what we could tell is probably about middle of the road compared to other states. It's not among the highest, but it's not among the lowest either. And our goal is to reduce or streamline those by 25%. So either cutting requirements or reducing the cost of requirements, all of that counts towards that 25% goal. 330,000, actually, total requirements.
Hold the mic up.
I would have guessed more if you had sort of asked me ahead of time.
It's an and there are some states that are quite a bit higher. Part of the reason why the number is where it is we did count what are called documents incorporated by reference, where you have additional standards, basically, that are integrated. But when you add all of that up, about 330,000 is where we landed. But I think the federal government, for instance, is considerably higher. The estimate that I've seen there is around 1.3 million total requirements. And I think that estimate was actually done using AI. There is a tool called QuantGov where they actually go.
But yours was not?
It was not, actually. Oh. So we did work with QuantGov. Actually, their number is actually a little lower than the 330,000. I think they come up with around 150 or thereabouts. And the main difference is they did not count the incorporated documents, whereas we do.
All right. So in our prep call, you mentioned something to Michael and me that I think isn't public yet, but you are willing to share it with us now. And that is an AI tool that you're using to look at. Well, why don't I just let you tell us about this new tool and what you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, and we sort of emphasize this at the event as well. So we only have about 6 months left in the administration, and the governor is always fond of saying, when we hit a goal and we set another goal, we're always hitting the accelerator. So one of our major initiatives in the last 6 months will be to look at a way to use artificial intelligence to go as far beyond that 25% goal as possible. So what we're doing is we're actually partnering with a small startup company, and they've developed developing a tool that can basically do a lot of this work that we've spent the last 3 years doing by hand, by human engagement, using artificial intelligence. And I can elaborate sort of on what that tool does. So first of all, what it does is it takes the text of Virginia regulations, which fortunately, and I'll mention in a second, this is not the case everywhere, but at least in the Commonwealth of Virginia, all of the regulations, the entire Virginia Administrative Code is available online on a site called LIS. In addition to that, the entire statutory code is available online, and this online resource actually links up each section of the regulation. It indicates what the authorizing statute is. So what this tool is actually doing is going in and scanning both the regulation itself and the statute itself and identifying potentially any disconnect between the two. So if the statute, as we've seen in some cases, the statute may have been repealed and, the regulation just hasn't been updated yet. So it can find those sorts of things. It can find any conflicts between the statute and the regulation. It can also basically identify whether the requirement is, and the term we use is discretionary. So basically the statute authorizes the agency to act, but it doesn't mandate the agency act. And when we look at our 25%, we're just looking at those discretionary requirements, not statutory mandates. So it can basically go in and tell the agency where it should focus in terms of identifying any potential opportunities for streamlining. And then an additional thing that it can do, we're in the process of working out right now, is it can compare Virginia to other states. And to me, I think this is actually the most revolutionary aspect of it. So, and I'll give you an example. We haven't actually done this yet, but one of the regs we looked at where we streamlined was the hours requirements for our barbers and cosmetologists. We require them to do 1,500 hours. And I got a few laughs from that. Actually, I always do anytime I speak. Apparently, the barbers and cosmetologists are about the most vehemently opposed to sort of any changes to their regulation, virtually any profession. Very, very protective. But amazingly, we were able to actually go in and reduce the hour requirement from 1,500 to 1,000 for cosmetologists. So, and then there are savings associated with that. So what this AI tool could do is it could go in and compare Virginia to other states. Virginia is now at 1,000. So it could look at Tennessee. It could look at North Carolina. It could look at West Virginia. It could find the equivalent regulation and say, okay, you're at 1,000. But let's say Tennessee, and I'm just making this number up, is at 800. So it can produce something like a heat map, essentially, and say, okay, here's where your regulatory restrictions compare to those in other states, and we're likely going to look at the states around us. This is actually something we wanted to do 3 years ago. When I first got started, I met with a member of Governor Little's staff in Idaho, and they said, well, what we really did in the professional licensing space is this comparative analysis. But we ultimately concluded we just couldn't do it. There just weren't the resources available because it's very, very time consuming to go in, find the relevant regulation, determine the number of hours, then do this comparative analysis. And what we think is this AI can actually massively accelerate that process for us. It can find where there are any distinctions and then can produce like a heat map, basically, that the agency can use. And as Michael and others have emphasized, the AI itself is not going to be making any changes. There will absolutely still be a human in the loop. That will be the agency staff itself that decides whether to make a change. But at the very least, it can provide a lot more information to the agency so they can have a better sense of where they may want to look to cut. I'll just mention one final thing, and that is, sadly, we only have 6 months left. So this is going to, I think, help us, get as far over the 25% as possible. But as I go around the country and speak, as other states consider doing something like this, or as the federal government considers doing something like this, I really think it can be a big, big accelerator. It's taken us 3 years to get to the 25%. And I think if a state started out with this sort of analysis and did this comparative, comparison, looked at where the discretionary requirements are, they could probably accelerate the process quite a bit. And they could probably do it with fewer resources as well. So I think this is really an exciting development and something that can really accelerate agencies' work.
I wanted to ask, do you mind if I ask you a probing question, or do you?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Because we heard, I think in each of the previous speakers talked about the comparative advantage of AI versus humans, and Carrie talked about when we talk about AI, it's compared to what. So I would love to bring Michael in and relate to what Reeve just said.
I think this is such a great example, which is the number of hours of training. Okay, which is that it's great to have the data, but it doesn't actually tell you whether or not these hours of training is actually improving safety. Okay, and the question is, can AI help you with that? Okay, in a way that actually enables you to say, well, that 3,000 hours is really there as a barrier to entry, as opposed to sort of 1,000 hours only being necessary. And do you want to say something?
Sure. Let's finish the question now.
I think that's what I'm sitting there sort of thinking, because this is such a classic example that we all sort of think about, which is because it's restrictions on trade. Okay. And if I'm, who is going to make, in the absence of data, who is going to make the decision? Okay. One of the things that comes out really strongly out of this is that we can have AI producing a lot more information than we had before, which was the heat map, which is, it's one thing to say you're an outlier, okay? And that's an important piece of information. It's another thing to say you're at 1,000, it could be 500, okay? And who makes that decision? Well, right now, that decision is made either at the agency level or at the statutory level, okay? And the political policymakers are embodied to make that decision, right? And so we have to make sure that we don't sort of extract the policymakers out of the loop.
Yeah, so agreed on all fronts. So, and what the AI can do, and I agree, we absolutely have to have policymakers, being the ones making the final decision, be it the legislature, if they are actually putting the requirement, in a statute, or the agency officials, if it's in a rulemaking. What I think what's really valuable about this heat map, though, is that, let's take that example you posit. Let's say we're at 1,000 hours, and we'll say Tennessee is at 500. absent any evidence that that's created a significant problem in Tennessee, absent any evidence that as a consequence of their barbers only getting 500 hours worth of training, they're making more mistakes, there are more lawsuits, there's some evidence that they're causing some harm. I think what this can do is it could sort of tell you, within the range of available training protocols that, unless there's sort of any suggestion that that's unsafe, it's at least something that the agency should look at. Now, there may be other reasons, why Virginia may be higher, but I think it's a data point.
It's a great data point that people don't have right now.
Exactly.
Did
you want to say any more, Michael, about human element? Maybe.
Yes. Let me actually say some more. Okay, because there's other ways of doing it. There's a bill out there by Senator John Husted of Ohio, and I wrote down the name of it. Okay. Leveraging artificial intelligence to streamline the Code of Federal Regulations Act of 2025. And this bill calls for an AI system to identify regulations in the federal code that are either out of date or redundant. Okay. Then the output of the AI system goes to the agency that promulgated the regulation that decides whether or not the category, the AI designation is correct. And if they say that it's correct, then the agency either does a rescission of the regulation in the Federal Register or does an amendment. All right. So that's Congress out of the loop. So that's a very different vision of how one uses AI. So from my perspective, I prefer Congress in the loop, but I can see that someone else might prefer Congress out of the loop if they sort of viewed Congress as sort of an impediment to fast decision making. Right? And I think in a lot of ways what we're doing, we're in the process, what the AI is going to do at this point is sort of raise certain questions about whether or not our institutional structures are not as efficient, but sort of doing what we want them to do. We're going to have to sort of think about, the AI and the AI models in some sense are the easy part of the process here, right? Because a lot of this is text, and so, for example, generating that heat map is not simple, but in some sense it's straightforward. But thinking about what our institutional structure is going to be more difficult. And I go back to the point about value, the value production capabilities that we have is something that we have to think about really clearly as we introduce the AI. The AI is, in its current form is the easy part.
So let me just tie that back to the last panel and talking about the Administrative Procedure Act requirements. What would that bill have agencies do? They would still need to defend their decision based on a record. Would it be based solely on the AI output?
I'm just reporting what the bill says. Okay, I could sort of read it. The bill is very straightforward. Okay,
and you and I are not lawyers. We probably can't tell you.
This is not my area of specialty. In fact, the reason why I had this piece of paper is that so I could actually read the language.
All
okay,
right.
But when we did the original version of the Regulatory Improvement Commission, we thought a lot about what the constitutionality was. Right now, I guess when you're talking about the APA, anything that sort of ends up going through Congress does not have to go through the APA. So the question is whether or not this bill gives enough of a congressional imprimatur to sort of avoid the APA requirements. And as you say, I'm not a lawyer, and this is not my area of expertise.
One of the things I think we'll do afterwards is send you all in a follow-up email some of the links to the different papers and things that people have talked about, and we'll make sure to include that bill in case people are interested. All right, we're doing well on time, but I think I have time to ask you one more question before we go to the audience. We've talked about use of AI to look at existing regulations that maybe could be improved, removed, modified. What about, are there ways can you think, how can AI be used to design, or how can agencies design regulations to take advantage of AI? And by that, I mean both the agencies can take advantage of AI, but also firms in trying to decide whether they're in compliance. So we talked about, Michael, you mentioned, or one of you talked about the regulatory code, but the regulatory code is not code, as in the AI kind of. Are there ways to make regulation more like code so that AI can help do that screening to decide whether it's in compliance?
So let me take a first shot at this. Okay, when you raised this question, I said, this is really interesting. And I thought about it in terms of construction. The construction industry, as you may or may not know, has been having falling productivity for 2 decades at this point, which is really weird, with all the information technology. And people sort of believe that the regulatory codes have gotten sufficiently complicated to sort of impede the application of new technology in the industry. So I would sort of say that it's an iterative process that we have to sort of pay attention as new technologies come up and new possibilities. What can be done to sort of make it more AI friendly and make those changes? This is not something that's going to happen all at once.
And I would echo everything that Michael said. I think that's exactly right. And I think it has to sort of be an iterative process, particularly as these new tools develop. A few thoughts. One is, and this is something very, very basic, but as I mentioned when describing our tool, Virginia has all of its regulations and statutes, guidance documents online. Not all states do. The states, and even of the states that do, it's not always in a particularly user-friendly format. So actually just earlier today, I won't say the states, but I was going...
Just say the state.
Sorry. But I want to be respectful to our colleagues, especially in sister states. But it's basically, some of them, it's a PDF. Some of them, it's not even that. Some of them, it's literally just a series of scans that are loaded. And actually, the PDFs, as I understand it with our vendor, they actually can go in and scan that. And that actually is a little harder, but it's still doable. A scan is much, much harder. So I think a first step is really just to get everything online. Make sure the regulations, the statutes, the guidance documents, that's something that I think President Trump in his first term really pushed, is to get every single guidance document available on the website, because there was nothing like that at the time. Just getting it available, I think, is in and of itself going to be enormously valuable to deploying these tools. In addition to that, I think sort of to build on or echo what Michael was saying, I think it'll be an iterative process. One thing that we're seeing as we've sort of coordinated with, organizations like QuantGov and so forth, is that the AI sort of does better on some types of language than others. One tricky thing is sort of how the regulation is phrased. So if it says shall or must, that's obviously a requirement. But sometimes, especially in legal text, wording can be used in a sort of unusual way, sort of a non-popular speaking way that AI tools have a little bit of trouble with. So we found there are some requirements that say may, but in fact it is a mandatory requirement. Others may not use words like must or shall. So to the extent that the wording can actually be standardized, and this is sort of a longer term process, it'll make it much easier for the AI tools to actually go in and, identify what are requirements and be able to do these sorts of comparisons. That's a longer term project, obviously, but honestly, just at the very least, getting all of this information available online across all 50 states and across the federal government. Of course, you have, the CFR, but with guidance documents, my understanding is that we are nowhere close currently to having all of them available online. And I think that would be enormously valuable in terms of facilitating this sort of AI-driven analysis.
Well, and I'm thinking even more than, I would think there are some types of regulations that may be more amenable to turning it into code than others. So economists, and I think Michael will agree with me, we tend to think that performance standards are better than a design standard that said you must install X. Is that going to be harder for AI to interpret than, and maybe this is just a vague podcast.
No, I think this kind of goes to the question about, do we care about outcomes? Okay. And there's a lot of parts of the regulatory system where we don't know what the outcomes are, right? Going back to the hours for manicurists. We don't know if is 500 necessary, is 1,000 necessary, is 1,500 necessary. there's the number of things that we do not know in the real world is enormous. And what the AI is going to point out to us is the enormous gap between what's in the code and what we know about whether outcomes are working or not. All right, and that's kind of analogous to the fact that AI is much more applicable in digital industries than it is in physical industries, and we're having productivity issues in physical industries like construction and manufacturing. And so what we're going to see going forward is that we're going to learn a lot by trying to apply AI, not just simply where AI works or not, but which parts of our code work or not. So it's going to be a learning process in both directions.
I'm going to open up Slido and see what questions you've all asked. And maybe while I do, let me just a quick one more from me. Getting back to Carrie's point about compared to what is where I mean, we've talked about some of AI strengths, but maybe Michael, to that point, in looking at outcomes, is it going to be better than what we have or worse? And I'll just toss that out while I pull up Slido. Joe, I might give you an exception.
It relates a little bit to what you all have just been talking about. I'm sorry, you mentioned that, Reeve, that your organization, does attempt to apply some cost-benefit principles to that. Let's go to your question about, well, suppose you find out it's 1,000 versus 1,500. How do you make a decision whether, 1,000 is better than or whatever? Okay, so the question I have is, to what extent are you at all exploring the use of AI to do some of these kinds of analyses, right, which are getting to your outcomes? I mean, not perfectly. Let me be clear about that right now, because those of us that practice CBA, like my friend Deb over here knows, it's a black art, but I mean, and it requires a lot of judgment. But hey, I've heard AI could do a lot of stuff with economics these days.
It requires a lot of information. It's very information intensive and very expensive. And it may very well be that what AI can tell you is where you get your biggest bang for the buck in spending the money on the cost-benefit analysis. So doing a cost-benefit analysis on the cost-benefit analysis, right? And it may very well be that you don't actually care that much about the 500 versus 1,000 hours, except you probably do, because it probably may very well affect what the price for manicurists are in your state.
Yeah, agreed on all fronts. And, one data point is, just a pure comparison. How does it compare to other states? This is more in the exploratory stage, but our hope is that we can also use it, at least preliminarily, to start, finding some of that information, going out and identifying information, identifying any studies, any relevant data points in terms of, if Tennessee is at 500 hours, how has that affected them, and it can be, I think, an accelerator in that sense, produce a preliminary cost-benefit analysis. The agency will probably have to supplement it to some extent. Exactly.
And the question is, whose judgment?
Well, the analysts.
Yeah, and that gets back to what we talked about in the last panel. AI doesn't mean that you don't need a reasoning human being to evaluate all the evidence that it's popping out.
That's right.
Yeah. So actually that answers one of the questions we got. Here's another interesting question. Why is nobody talking about using AI to undergird a regulatory compliance assistance portal, like NAICS code, firm size driven, plain language? Is that something you're considering in Virginia?
So it's something we certainly give us some thought to. Unfortunately, with sort of the 6 months, we didn't really have the time. But yeah, I think it's a fantastic question, and I think that's going to be another major application. So the government itself can use it to do the sort of analyses that we're describing. But I think another thing that it can do is for a business, especially a small business that may not necessarily have the resources to go out and hire a big law firm to do the analysis for it. It can go in and just sort of take the regulation as a given and say, okay, here's what applies to you. Here's sort of a preliminary compliance plan. I think it's a game changer there. One thing we are looking at, and this is a very, very limited application of that, but I mentioned that we have this portal that has various permit applications on it. So what we're doing in a very, very limited way, we're looking at doing, is basically saying, okay, you can now see where your permit is in the process, But just to give a simple example, let's say I want to sell like cake pops, out of my garage on eBay. Well, in order to do that, there are various permits you have to get. And as I understand it, in Virginia, it's the Virginia Department of Health that issues that permit. If it has any meat product in it, the VDACS, Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, has a role. And just figuring that out in and of itself is very, very difficult, especially for a small business like that. So what we're looking at is actually like a chatbot, basically, that you could go in and say, okay, here's what I want to do. Here's the type of thing I want to sell. Here's the quantity I want to sell. Do I need a permit? If so, which permit or permits do I need? And how do I go about applying for those? And the chatbot would give you an answer, would spit all that out. And it's a fairly simple example, but if you think about it from a small business perspective, especially a small business whose business model does not sort of fit into sort of traditional ways of doing things. So, a restaurant, it's obvious you need a permit for that. Even like a food cart, it's obvious you need a permit for that. But if you're selling out of your garage, you may or may not need a permit, depending on quantities. And the difficult question, and you'd presumably have to go hire counsel to figure it out for you. And our goal here is to basically allow the AI to give you a preliminary answer there. Now, again, this is just very limited, but I think that's sort of one illustration of the types of potential that this has to really basically reduce the cost of compliance, to reduce the barriers to entry and allow people to much more quickly and easily determine what exactly it is they need to do in order to achieve full regulatory compliance.
Let me just add something to that, which is that the word that comes to my mind right away is, of course, hallucination. Okay. And so what you would need to sort of have along with that, I mean, it's a good idea, but you need to have a robust process for sort of talking to a real person. And what I mean by robust is you actually have to put real resources into it. And this goes to the larger question about what the nature of jobs are going to be under AI, right? That we're not going to talk about today. But, this works if somebody has a place to sort of say, I'm not sure you've given me the right answer. Okay. Can I talk to a real person?
I think you make a fantastic point, Michael, and that's why we're sort of deploying it or looking to deploy it on a very limited basis, because it's important that it get it right 100% of the time. Because if it tells you you need permits X and Y, and actually you need permits X, Y, and Z, it just leaves Z out, then that's a real problem. You basically have the government, the chatbot, has effectively given somebody wrong information. And so that's why, particularly, at least if it's the government itself that's deploying the chatbot, it's really, really important to test it, deploy it in a test environment, ensure that it's getting the right answer. And that's why I think it'll probably take some time before you could deploy that more broadly. Theoretically, you could plug a question into ChatGPT like that right now, and it might give you a better answer than you'd think, but it's probably going to be wrong in some respects. And that's why, we're being very, very careful and deliberative in terms of, rolling anything like that out.
But it is a very interesting use case. And it gets to Carrie's point again about it's going to be wrong sometimes, but compared to what? Because you can call and talk to a human who gets these things wrong too. And so how do you have that combination of the kind of the accountability of and the legitimacy of talking to a human with some of the efficiency that the AI can bring? Michael, do you?
Go ahead.
No, I just wondered if you agreed on that or.
Well, I mean, what that calls up for me is the original question you sort of asked about changing the regulations to sort of be more AI friendly, right? What you want to do is you want to eliminate as much ambiguity from the regulations as possible, right? And so our ultimate goal is to make the regulations, to write the regulations so there's less of a chance of making mistakes from the AI's point of view, because you want to squeeze as much of that out, and as you might have guessed, that's going to be a 20-year process.
Another question is, some agencies are using specialized tools, like it sounds like Virginia is. What are your thoughts on commonly available tools like Copilot, ChatGPT, et cetera, for reviewing and editing regulations?
So I would be reluctant to deploy it in that context. I mean, I guess sort of the question is, you say, Susan, sort of as compared to what? I mean, admittedly, and I've not relied on this analysis, but, occasionally it's simple. Like if I'm looking for a regulation, I'd just, go ask ChatGPT, what is that? But then obviously you can't rely on the answer. Obviously you have to go and independently check that and ensure that it's right. So, if somebody just wants a quick and dirty answer as to what may be applicable here, then yeah, I think a commercially available product is not a bad way to go. It's a good place to get started, can sort of help identify things that otherwise might have taken you a much longer amount of time to identify if you were Googling it, or you may not have been able to identify it at all if you were just sitting there with the table of contents, but you're not going to want to rely upon an answer like that. As we get to more official uses being made either by the government itself, like what I've been discussing, or by a regulated party who really needs a correct answer, needs something that's 100% accurate because they're going to base their behavior on that, then I think you probably want to use a tool that's much more specialized than that. I think among other things, some of the commercially available products, I think they're trained, and I'm not an AI expert, so I may be misspeaking here, but I think they're basically trained on plain language. So when you get into legal language that, lawyers speak differently than how everyday people do, I think the risk of hallucination goes up. And I think that's why it's important for more official uses, to use something that you have more confidence that the answer is going to be 100% accurate.
I have several questions for you, Reeve, and I think that last answer may have responded to some of them. So what criteria do you use? So once your AI has identified a regulation that maybe is more than other states or that is beyond what the statute requires, how do you who makes the decision? How do you make it? Do you use benefit cost analysis? What other kind of criteria? I think I'm jumbling together several or consolidating several questions for you there.
Yeah, no, all important issues. So sort of the analysis would look something like this. First of all, if, there's obviously the hierarchy, statute, regulation, guidance documents. So the first thing to ascertain, and the AI should actually tell us this, is does the statute mandate it or not? So to use the cosmetology example again, if the statute says now, this is regulatory rather than statutory, but if the statute were to say barbers have to have 1,000 hours worth of training, then the agency obviously can't change that. They would have to seek legislation in order to make a fix there. But most of the time, the statute says something like barbers, should have an appropriate amount of training in order to ensure that they can provide their services in a safe manner. So in that case, assuming the statute gives you the discretion as to how you decide it, that's where I think this comparative analysis is really, really valuable. Look at how you compare at the state level, to your sister states. You could presumably use it at the federal level, and do an international comparison, or if the states have concurrent jurisdiction, look at what the states are doing. And that's another data point. And then, if you're confident then that you can make a change to your regulation, then you do the cost benefit analysis. Then you go in and say, okay, if we're going from, let's say, 1,000 hours down to 500 hours, how much savings will that create? So, people get to work faster. It presumably expands the labor market, labor supply. There are all sorts of benefits associated with it. The cost would presumably be, if it's 500 hours lower, what's the risk that as a result of that, you're going to have more injuries? So you do that cost benefit analysis, and then you decide based on that whether it's a worthwhile change to make. So at no point is the AI actually making a decision. It's simply giving you some additional information, additional data, flagging relevant studies, flagging differences among states, and then it's either the agency itself, if it's a regulatory issue, or the legislature, if it's a statutory issue, determining, do we want to make a change here?
And it's going to differ by state. Okay, states will have different configurations of rules that will sort of point you in one direction or another.
That's a great point as well. And some states are a lot more detailed than others in terms of how much direction they give the agency in terms of what those requirements should be.
I'll tie that back to Bridget's opening remarks, where something that sticks in her craw is this use of humans in the loop, because she says it needs to be more than in the loop. You need to be that the process of writing the regulation and making the decisions is part of the reasoning process. And that gets to another question. Does Virginia have an equivalent of the APA for these kinds of procedures?
We do. I've had to kind of relearn the usage. So it's the Administrative Process Act rather than the Administrative Procedure Act, which always throws me off. But yeah, so we have the Administrative Process Act. In many respects, it's modeled directly on it's very similar to the federal APA. We actually have a 3-step process where we do what's called a NORA, Notice of Intended Regulatory Action, which is basically like an ANPRM at the federal level. Then we have a proposed regulation that's equivalent to an NPRM, and then a final regulation. So there are plenty of points throughout that process for input, from the agency and from the governor's office, but also from the public. There are actually 2 comment periods, or 3 technically, though only 2 before the rule gets finalized. So that's yet another opportunity for, anybody who may be affected by the regulation to say, okay, here's how this is going to affect me. And then, those data points are considered as well. So it's all, human decision makers, the agency, but also the public and the governor's office and others that are participating that make the final call. AI really just supplements that.
I think that's really important because our goals here are not given to us by the AI. It could be less regulation. It could be better regulation. It could be sort of more efficient regulation. The way we specify our goals really determines how the AI is used and what decisions are made. And that's going to be, that's going to be a part of the political process rather than simply a regulatory process. And we can't get away without that.
All right, so I've got a couple good questions for you, Michael, but one picks right up on that. What are your thoughts on a nonpartisan office for training AI to be used by the whole of the federal government to avoid potential biases?
What do you mean by a nonpartisan office? I'm kind of
Maybe like your Regulatory Improvement Commission, but with a different mission.
No, I don't. To me, that's not the top goal there. Okay, I think there's a lot of different uses of AI in different parts of the government that require different training, and that I'm less concerned with bias in the AI and more concerned with bias in the decision process. All right, I mean when I'm talking about whether it's at the state level, political policymakers have values. The values will get imposed on the process, whether or not you have AI or not, right? And so I think that's kind of essential there. I'd be less concerned with a nonpartisan office for that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. This one I think is for you too, Michael. How does AI getting the answer wrong affect government accountability?
So that gets back to Carrie's point about
compared to what?
Compared to what? Let me give you part of the way that I think about this. Why autonomous vehicles have been tough to roll out because you kind of have to build an explicit decision-making process for tough edge cases. And it's not that they're worse than people, but you're actually making a decision in the case of the AI, the autonomous vehicles, about what decision you're going to make when you see a child and an animal on the street. It has to sort of be built into the system. And so part of the question about what's better is it going to be consistently making mistakes? This gets to the bias question, I guess, in one direction or another. So once again, I'm sort of less concerned with the mistakes and more concerned with who's making the ultimate decision. So when it gets back to Bridget's question about human in the loop, the objectification there is the word human, okay, as opposed to sort of identifying the person or the role who's actually making the decision.
Yes, getting back to your point about is it Congress, is it someone in the agency, which is an age-old question that
when Congress takes a vote, does anybody say that Congress is wrong in its vote? The answer is yes, they do. But ultimately, Congress has the right to sort of make that decision because that's the way we've set up the system. And that's the value production that Carrie talked about. And we're going to have to sort of pay closer attention to that in the AI world because we can't sort of bury it in the ambiguity anymore.
All right. And there's a question. Can the federal government do the same thing as what Virginia is doing? But let me broaden it. So first you answer that one, but then maybe broaden for both of you. What do you think Doge is doing? Are they using any of these tools? And what lessons could they learn from both of your insights?
Great, both great questions. So, with respect to whether the federal government can do this, I think the answer is definitely yes. I think one of the challenges, at least with guidance documents, would be getting them up online. But I think basically, similarly to Virginia, you have the CFR. It's an online resource. You have the U.S. Code. It's also an online resource. It could do the same comparative analysis. In fact, in some ways, it's actually a little bit easier at the federal level than it is at the state level, because at the state level, you're sort of intermediate. You have the federal government, you have the state government, and then you have the local government. So in Virginia, there are plenty of instances where our state statutes don't necessarily mandate something, but the federal law does. The federal government mandates it. And of course, we have to comply with that. So at the state level, you're actually doing two levels of analysis. What does the state statute require? What does the federal statute require? And you have to ensure full compliance with both. Whereas at the federal level, you have the luxury of being sort of at the top of the totem pole, and therefore you don't have to do that additional analysis. So you could look at what different states are doing, especially in areas where there's some concurrent jurisdiction between the two, and sort of how that informs the federal analysis. But at least in terms of sort of the straight comparison, I think it's absolutely doable. With the cost-benefit analysis, I do think that that's a little more difficult, but I think there too, as I mentioned at the outset, it's really only 2% from what I've seen roughly of rules, I think, that get a full cost-benefit analysis under Executive Order 12866. So you could theoretically expand that, extend it, to additional regulations, maybe not necessarily as part of the official centralized process, but agencies could certainly try to expand the scope of rules to which they're applying cost-benefit analysis. So I think the potential is absolutely there. I think there are some quirks with the federal process, but I think for the most part, it's similar enough that it would actually be sort of a very, very similar approach to applying it. As to what Doge is currently doing in this space, I don't know that I have really sort of any intelligence that I can share. I know that they've used AI in other contexts. I know that they've used it in the context of contracting, for instance. And we really think that it's a natural fit for regulation. In fact, if anything, it's easier because you have the information already available online in a readily accessible format.
Let me just raise one point about Doge, yes. Can you hear me? There's data sets in the federal government that are intentionally kept separate. Okay. It would be, and the U.S. does not have a national ID card, which is kind of the equivalent. Right. And so we've made a policy decision to for better or for worse, okay, to sort of accept a certain amount of inefficiency in order to maintain a certain amount of privacy plus autonomy. That's a policy decision. And so we can't confuse the AI-driven efficiencies with policy decisions. And I keep coming back to that again, because it's going to come up over and over again when we sort of deal with AI in the government, which is that that there's going to be decision. We all want efficiency, but efficiency is going to carry certain consequences with it that we need to sort of be really explicit about.
Sorry, I was just making a note about that. I think that's an important point. So, and I think we've heard that across the panels, this notion that yes, AI has a comparative advantage in efficiency, but that isn't the only thing that.
The only thing.
Yeah. All right. You each have a couple minutes if you want. Are there other comments you'd like to make before we close?
Let me just make one comment. As sort of a PPI, we believe that government reform, making government work better, is essential. And AI is an essential part of that. But we also have to sort of make sure that when we do that, we're not losing our values. So I'm going to think about the carries value production sort of function, which is, may very well be that the best use of AI is to sort of help us produce values better than we do now.
Absolutely agreed. And I think what I would emphasize is, we've been very mindful in Virginia of the fact that, AI really has enormous promise here, but it's also very, very important to be deliberative in terms of how it's applied. I saw a graph recently, I'm probably going to butcher the terminology, but it said something about like peak hype, essentially, with respect to AI. And I'm old enough now to remember, the rise of the internet in the 90s. And it was something that was, going to change everything. And it ultimately did. But there was a period where people were really sort of assuming that certain business models, certain applications were viable. I remember when everything, had a website, eToys, ePets.com, and, ultimately it did all, consolidate. But it was a process. And I think similarly, especially when you look at the use of AI in government, I think there are enormous potentials. I think it's already, as we're using it, being used in ways that can really accelerate the efforts of what agencies are doing, what legislators are doing, and decision makers across the government and outside the government. But I think it's very, very important to be mindful of both its capabilities and then its limitations and to proceed in a deliberative way. And that's where I think particularly, and we've sort of, heard this throughout this panel, it's important to ensure that a human decision maker is the one ultimately making the decision, aided by AI tools. And that's something that we've really ensured in Virginia. We've emphasized that that's a tool to help legislators and agency officials do their job more efficiently, but the decision making is ultimately for the official representatives to decide.
Join me in thanking Michael and Reeve.